there, first grade scholars and families. Welcome back to domain number 10, A New Nation, American Independence. Today's lesson is going to be all about George Washington, Commander-in-Chief. Our first goal today is to describe the founding of the United States. How did the United States become an independent nation? The second goal is to tell a little bit about who George Washington is and what he did. And the third goal is to understand and use the word struggled. Let's get started. Before we get started with our lesson, there are 3 things that we want to make sure to do so we can do our best learning today. The first is to grab a learning buddy to come and sit next to you. This can be a parent, grandparent, a sibling, or anybody else who you could talk to about what we're learning. The next is to grab a pencil and paper. This is so you can write down important information or answers to questions that come up in our lesson today. Last, you're going to make sure to listen for this bell sound, and that will tell you it's time to come back together and listen to the teacher. If you find out you need some extra time, just click pause on the video. Let's get started. You'll remember that while representatives to the Second Continental Congress met and signed the Declaration of Independence, George Washington was really far away from Philadelphia. He was sent north to Boston to fight the British. His was a very difficult job. Washington's army was made mostly of farmers who had no military experience at all. They didn't have uniforms, and they only had old guns called muskets, which they barely knew how to fire. There weren't enough guns, and there was hardly any gunpowder. The wording of the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1776. 5 days later, messengers carrying copies of the Declaration reached New York, where General Washington's army was camped. His army heard the words and rallied in support of independence. A statue of King George was melted down into bullets for the Continental Army. The men soon realized that they would never have enough bullets for the fight ahead. Later that summer, British warships were spotted entering New York's harbor. King George had gotten help from the Germans as well. More than 30,000 trained troops arrived to fight the unprepared colonial militiamen. George Washington nearly lost his army in the fierce fighting around New York and New Jersey that fall. The Redcoats chased the Continental Army south across the Delaware River. Thinking that they'd scared them off, the Redcoats left only a small force to guard them on the other side of the river. It was December, and they felt sure that nobody would fight during the dead of winter, but they were wrong. George Washington came up with a daring plan. On Christmas night, he gathered his men together. It was snowing and cold, but Washington had the men get into their boats and row quietly across the ice-filled river. More than 2,000 soldiers went across, and it took several hours. Marching through the wind and sleet of the December cold, the Continental Army reached the British troops just before dawn. While the Redcoats were still sleeping, Washington's men launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp. The Redcoats were surprised, all right. Some of them came out of their bunks in their underwear and just held up their hands. It was a total victory for General Washington. Nobody in his army had been killed. Washington and his army returned to Philadelphia to shouts of joy, but the war wasn't over quite yet. The Continental Congress knew that they needed more help in order to win their war for independence. German soldiers were fighting alongside the British, so the colonists thought that maybe the French would send soldiers across the ocean to help the colonists fight against the British. It was no secret that the French and the British had been enemies for a long time. The Continental Congress decided to send some men to France to ask for their support. Their chief representative was 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin. The French did not like to lose in battle, and they were still angry about losing to the British in an earlier war. At first, they didn't want to support the colonists. It was crazy to think that an army full of farmers could defeat one of the best armies in the world, the British. But an American victory in New York in the fall of 1777 changed their opinion overnight. They promised gunpowder, soldiers, and ships. General Washington's army was camped in Pennsylvania at a place called Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778. Snow lay on the ground when Washington and his men arrived. They pitched tents and built log cabins, but neither kept out the cold. The men were dressed in rags, and many of them had no shoes, walking barefoot in the snow. There was hardly any food, and some days the men had little to eat and drink besides bread and water. Disease spread through the camp, and many men died. The men missed their families and wanted to go home. Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits. He camped in a tent beside them for a time, earning their respect. No battles were fought at Valley Forge that winter, but the cold and hungry men spent hours training to be ready when they met the British again in the spring. I've got a couple questions for you to see what you remember from the read aloud. Sit down with your learning buddy and listen up. In the read aloud, you heard Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits. Struggled means had difficulty and worked very hard to accomplish something. For example, I could say, I struggled to get up the steps with a heavy box. Have you ever struggled with a task? Try to use the word struggled when you tell about it. Next, I'm going to ask a question. You can use the word struggled in your answer as you're telling your learning buddy. Have you ever struggled to get out of bed in the morning? Have you ever struggled with cleaning your room? Have you ever struggled to find something? Have you ever struggled to wait your turn? Great job, first grade. Give yourself a pat on the back and let's get ready for our last activity. Your last task is to write a caption for this photo. Remember, a caption is a sentence or a few sentences that tell what's happening in the picture. So you might want to think about a few different questions to help you write your caption today. What are some things that you see in the photo? Who are those people that are in the picture and what are they doing? Do you see something important that we talked about in the last lesson, like an important symbol? What is this boat doing there and what are they doing in it? Think about the answers to those questions and you'll be able to come up with your very own sentence to tell everyone else what is happening in this picture. Let's get started.